Welcome to the STEM Talk. In just 30 minutes each month, join experts from across the STEM landscape as they provide factual information, practical strategies, and actionable resources to help you navigate the ever-changing world of STEM education, workforce development, policy, and advocacy. Hosted by the Afterschool STEM Hub, STEM Education Coalition, and STEM Ecosystems, the STEM Talk creates a safe space for dialogue while maintaining a focus on information that matters to you and the community that you serve. Today's episode is called FY27, What's at Stake? And if you work in STEM education, after school, or advocacy, this one is for you. Hi, I'm Jenny Frank, and I'm the director of the STEM Ecosystem Initiative at TIES Global. On April 3rd, the White House released its FY2027 budget request. And for the STEM community, the proposal is significant. It calls for eliminating 21st century community learning centers for the second straight year, cutting the National Science Foundation by more than half, terminating NASA's Office of STEM Engagement, and consolidating dozens of K-12 programs into a single block grant. These are proposals, not law. Congress still holds the power of the purse, and we've seen before that bipartisan advocacy can and does move the needle. But the appropriations process is underway right now, and the window to engage is open. So today we're asking, what's actually in this budget request? What does it mean for the programs and the communities you serve? And what should STEM leaders be doing this spring? That's exactly what we're unpacking, so let's welcome our expert guests. Today we have Della Cronin. She is principal at Bose Public Affairs Group. James Brown is the executive director of the STEM Education Coalition. And Anita Krishnamurthy. She is Senior Vice President for STEM and Youth Civic Engagement at the Afterschool Alliance. Welcome, everyone. Let's get started.
We're going to try and go quickly through what's in this year's budget request and what some of the advocacy opportunities are that stand before us. And, to underline a point, if there was one thing to take away from this, our advocacy over the past year and a half has made a difference. We're going to talk about what we see in this year's budget request process. The budget request from the administration is typically the beginning of the process of sorting out what the federal budget priorities are. This year's budget request, like the last several since the COVID era, is much later in the process than traditionally. Budget requests have come out, which means Congress is already well down the road of dealing with budget priorities. They've already held hearings and things of that kind. We'll get to some of that. There are a number of specific things we want to single out with regard to STEM education, informal science learning, the budgets for both science agencies and the Department of Education. The appropriations process for many years has been quite dysfunctional, but this last year, notwithstanding a handful of government shutdowns for a handful of agencies, Congress passed all of the appropriations bills for all of the different federal agencies, and they were passed in a bipartisan fashion. And they, established congressional intent and congressional priorities for the entire federal government for the last year. It was not a long year-long continuing resolution or any of the partial solutions we've had. We're going to talk about some of where that consensus is, and then we're going to wrap up with a few of the actions that you can take now and in the future.
Okay. So, the big picture in terms of the FY 2027 budget request is not a surprising one. We were not expecting this administration to propose significant new investments in education or STEM education or the many programs that we as STEM advocates feel are important and should be invested in a healthy way each year. There are steep reductions proposed across the federal education and science agencies once again. Again, not a surprise and consistent with what we're hearing from the White House about its priorities. The National Science Foundation, once again, is slated for reductions from the White House to the tune of about 50% when compared with what was enacted for the previous year. The Department of Education would also be cut, and the interagency agreements would continue to be implemented. Frankly, for those of us who watch these numbers every year, trying to figure out what this administration is proposing for the programs that have been administered by the Department of Education is a little tricky because it's not one for one year to year. Some of those programs are now, for example, career technical education investments are now sort of firmly ensconced over at the Department of Labor. So as advocates, we're having a little of a tricky time figuring out year to year numbers. But regardless, there are not significant increases proposed anywhere, and advocates are certainly looking at holding the line on many of these programs. Once again, the administration has proposed collapsing dozens of K-12 programs into one much smaller investment. In this instance, it's called the Make Education Great Again block grant. That would be a $2 billion block grant administered at the state level. That would include Titles II, which is teacher professional development funds, as well as 4 Part A, which is the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grant Program, and Part B, which is the 21st Century Community Learning Centers program. Those would all be consolidated into a much smaller block grant program and sent to the states, which is consistent with the Department of Education's priority to sort of return education to the states and have them make decisions about how those dollars are spent. But as James said, and will continue to say throughout the next 30 minutes, it is Congress who ultimately decides what programs are funded at what level, and Congress conveys its congressional intent to the agencies about how those funds are spent.
So a few things to gain your attention in this very crowded environment. So we've all seen the back and forth from education agencies, the National Science Foundation, other science agencies over the pause, the reprioritization of grant funding. At the end of the day, the way this process has worked the last several years is the administration has taken the position that its budget request is the guiding document for the agencies until Congress produces a budget for those fiscal years. So we can expect that to continue. And so there's a variety of different analysis out there looking at what's being funded within the different agencies, where the grant programs are in terms of their individual status. That's a link to that. The budget proposal would eliminate the 21st Century Community Learning Center program at the Department of Education. That's the only federal funding stream for after school and summer learning. There are lots of groups warning that the cuts would weaken long-term U.S. competitiveness. That's sort of the position that Congress has taken, is that these investments are in place for good reason. And despite the fact that the administration has taken the position they want to send education back to the states, Congress has been very clear in saying they want to continue federal funding for a variety of different STEM workforce and competitiveness programs. And lastly, one of the things that you might see in the future is more pressure on informal science education programs, both at the National Science Foundation and the Department of Education, as the administration tries to further consolidate different programs. And I'll take a moment to answer a question in the chat about block grants, because that's one of the things we're concerned about. So Della mentioned the administration has proposed consolidating a number of federal funding streams into so-called block grants. What that means is the federal government, instead of administering separate programs to states for, say, 21st Century and the Title IV Part A program, which is the Student Success and Academic Enrichment Grants Program, which funds STEM, educational technology, student health. It's where the Math and Science Partnership Program resides in the current federal budget structure. Instead of administering those grants separately for those individual purposes, to give the total of those grants to the states in what's called a block grant, which they can use for basically any purpose authorized by federal statute. So in essence, that's what they mean by sending education back to the states. That's what they mean by block granting. Della, back to you.
Yeah, and I'll just add, as we're talking about block grants, I would say as advocates, we are concerned about efforts to collapse those specific funds into one big block grant and sort of trust states to do the right thing, because I think what we've seen is certainly in terms of the flexibilities afforded states and districts in the application of Title I and Title II, they often lump those funds together and spend them on class size reduction or teacher salaries or things that are not what we would consider to be the congressional intent of those programs. So that's why we find that troubling and sort of a slippery slope when we talk about block grants. And here you can see, additionally why some of those proposals are troubling. As I mentioned, advocates are having a hard time getting specific on the numbers this year because of the interagency agreements and sort of the disbursement of those programs to other agencies. But overall, it is not a surprise that the White House is requesting less for the Department of Education as they continue to try to eliminate that agency. Title I grants continue to enjoy bipartisan support and support from the administration and would be level funded under the request. IDEA similarly enjoys bipartisan support and has been arguably underfunded since its inception. So it would get a modest increase. We've talked about 21st Century and how it would be one of the programs that would be subsumed into that block grant, which we would find to be problematic. Title II, Part A, which is those important professional development funds. In particular, we think those are crucial to STEM educators, would also be eliminated or consolidated. That was proposed last year, and Congress rejected that proposal and level funded that program. The same is true for Title IV, Part A, which is, as James mentioned, where STEM education, technology, other things can be funded. It would also be in that block grant program. And there you see that this new block grant program, MEGA, which is Make Education Great Again, would be a $2 billion program. And certainly that sum is much smaller than the total of all those programs that would be eliminated in favor of that. $2 billion goes fast across 50 states. And we would argue that that is not nearly enough for all those needs that those programs encompass right now.
So just to get a little more specific with the 21st Century program, to underline something Della said, this administration has been very keen on reorganizing the Department of Education in general. And so, we've underlined this several times, but part of the challenge here is the idea of taking these grant programs that are for specific purposes and aggregating them into a number of block grants is something that a number of states are actually quite keen on. So some states have applied for waivers to federal requirements that would allow them to do this on their own. So this is not without allies, but the sense of the general education community is outside of a handful of states that tend to be very conservative states. This is a bad idea because it loses Congress's oversight over the priorities of these programs. And because of some of the things we learned during COVID, when you make large block grants to the states, lots of things get overlooked for the needs of the day. So that's part of the push and pull between setting federal priorities that are long-term and designed to be with the whole country in mind, and allowing local education priorities to weigh out all the time. So that's the tension that this is appealing to. And every year it's proposed, it probably inches a little closer to reaching consensus amongst a growing number of states and local authorities that essentially say, well, want to throw their hands in the air and say, look, the federal government can't quite get its act together. Let's just make all those decisions locally. So that's the back and forth. What this would mean is the dedicated focus on after-school STEM programs would likely disappear. They would probably redirect some of the funds that are going to after school to other, non-after school purposes. And the other part of this is there's this growing abundance of STEM-rich learning opportunities in vulnerable and high-need communities that are being supported by 21st Century funds. We would be concerned that those would be some of the first casualties of this proposed consolidation.
So to switch agencies, because of course we're very concerned about what's going on at other agencies that support STEM and research investments. The White House has proposed a troubling decrease over at the National Science Foundation. It would cut its funding almost in half. I think that we would again see some vulnerability in this proposal for STEM education investments over at the foundation. Last year, the White House tried to eliminate the STEM Education Directorate. That proposal was rejected by Congress forcefully. In fact, there was some pretty forceful report language in the final spending bills that showed that members of Congress thought that the STEM Education Directorate was quite important to the country's future. But of course, the administration is in charge of the agency and has significant sway on how those funds are spent. So we are still concerned about how this proposal would affect investments that support teachers and learning how best to teach STEM subjects, the broadening participation mission of the agency, and as well as the informal STEM learning programs, which have already been collapsed into that STEM education solicitation that the agency is running. The research community is also concerned about this proposal for the National Science Foundation and see it as an ongoing assault to research universities and their mission. Museums feel the same way. Other STEM education stakeholders who have been participating in programs at the National Science Foundation also feel like the proposal would be problematic for them. I think, as we talked about a lot in last month's STEM Talk, AI continues to be a priority for this administration, and you can see that in the budget proposal, as well as its emphasis on the TIP Directorate and other things that are going on at the National Science Foundation, and how workforce, the defense sector, quantum investments remain important.
And Della, something I'll add for this as we talk about NSF, I'll go back to a point that you and I have made consistently over the last year, which is one of our big messages to the community is keep your proposals coming into the National Science Foundation. You know, when you see all these changes and the uncertainty with regard to NSF funding streams, it's tempting to say, why should I even apply for NSF funds? But ironically, if less people are applying, it increases your chances of perhaps getting funding. So we've been telling groups, make sure you're still submitting proposals. It was mentioned in the chat, NSF has re-emphasized, get your proposals in early this summer because the intent of NSF is to give out all of the fiscal year 2026 funds appropriated by Congress. So that's especially important to get those proposals in this summer so they can still be funded in this fiscal year. And just to go over the various different accounts that are proposed here, the administration has really put a lot of pressure on the STEM Education Directorate. That's something our coalition in particular has really advocated for maintaining at NSF as an overall priority, just because it's the foundation for so much knowledge creation within the STEM education fields that underlies some of the critical facilities and critical focus areas the administration has proposed in semiconductor manufacturing and quantum and some of the other areas that Della has highlighted. One of the other things that they're targeting are things like graduate research fellowships, making sure that there's more American students on those graduate research fellowships. They have definitely proposed reducing the emphasis on broadening participation. That's another specific area where Congress has directed NSF to continue its statutory authorized efforts in broadening participation and to keep those, on the right side of all of the legal precedents and so forth, but to continue that mission for sure.
Okay, so what we're seeing on the Hill right now, if you haven't been paying attention, the House Appropriations Subcommittees are already putting together their FY27 appropriation spending bills. I think the tardiness of the White House's budget request, as well as the calendar pressures that an election year present, have really sort of put the fire into House Appropriations Committee Chairman Tom Cole, who's a Republican from Oklahoma, to get this process started. The Commerce, Justice, Science Bill, which is where the National Science Foundation and other research agencies are funded, is going to be marked up by the House subcommittee in charge of that bill on May 13th. And then the Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education markup is scheduled for June 5th. That is the last in line, as usual, because it is the largest, most controversial, and most difficult bill for lawmakers to consider. The Senate, as is always the case, their action will come later this summer. There's not a defined schedule for them yet. And, we're going to keep saying this over and over again. A proposal is just that, and Congress will ultimately decide what programs and agencies get funded at what levels. We still enjoy bipartisan support for after school and workforce development and STEM competitiveness, and this was evident most recently when Secretary McMahon was in front of the Senate Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education Appropriations Subcommittee answering questions about this budget request. She got tough questions from both sides of the aisle about the proposed block grant, about how to make sure that underserved communities were getting the funds they needed to best serve the students that were going to their schools. It was heartening to see. And in particular, Senator Capito asked about 21st century community learning centers and what their future would be under the proposal. So it's clear that we have allies on Capitol Hill, and we should engage with them and support them in their endeavors. Since it's an election year, not only is the legislative calendar experiencing quite a bit of pressure, but we can expect that this process will not be finished before the election, and that lawmakers will want to take care of it after we figure out who's going to be in charge of the House and Senate next year.
So this is the part where you can do something about this. So there's a number of opportunities here. The links are active here. We will circulate these slides afterwards so everybody has them. And Anita's going to put these opportunities in the chat as we go through them. Any individual, any organization can submit testimony. The Senate is still accepting testimony on these programs. There's guidelines on this link for how to submit that testimony. So if your organization is thinking about taking a position in support of some or the other of the federal agencies that we've talked about here today, regardless of what that position is, we want you to make sure your voices are known if you're willing to do that. It's a great opportunity to force yourself to organize your thoughts in writing about how you might advocate for some of these agencies. You know, there are a variety of different ways to contact your House and Senate appropriators. The After School Alliance does a lot of this. The STEM Hub does a lot of this. The STEM Education Coalition does a lot of this. We're going to get to some of the action alerts further down. Look for those opportunities to join in advocacy and fly-ins virtually or in person. If you haven't done that in a few years, it's definitely a good opportunity to do that kind of advocacy, and 'tis the season for that type of activity. If you haven't invited a lawmaker to visit your after-school or STEM-related program in a while, it's definitely something you should consider doing. You know, all these legislators want stories about what's going on in their own communities with regard to these important programs. Making sure you're collecting local impacts, that's really important. Make sure you document the success stories. Make sure you post those pictures on social media and you communicate the information about what these programs are doing. And lastly, making sure you're in touch with your state peers. One of the best things you can do is look around, find a STEM ecosystem, find an after-school network, find a STEMX network, find a STEM organization that supports those goals, and make sure you're engaging in common cause within your own local communities about these things. And to make this really specific, there are a number of action alerts that we have up right now where you can individually send letters to Capitol Hill on behalf of these priorities. The After School Alliance has one up. The STEM Education Coalition has one up. You can click on the links in the chat, send a letter within seconds to Capitol Hill emphasizing these priorities. And it's something that we really need to lean on individuals in the community to be doing so that we have those letters, those conversations, those emails flowing into offices on both sides of the aisle and from all parts of the country.
I'll just add, if you belong to an organization that does the Capitol Hill fly-in and you've never done that, I would recommend you do that. And just know that organizations that you belong to or that you care about are sending members and to Capitol Hill. I know the After School Alliance hosted a Hill Day earlier this year. I know that the physics teachers have been on the Hill. I know that the math teachers have been on the Hill. There have been lots of conversations on the Hill in person about STEM education investments and what's needed at the local level. So be rest assured that that's happening, but your voice is always welcome there as well. And in doing that, there are some key messages. I think this will be familiar. We're sort of reiterating what they are as we go, but you know firsthand that after school STEM programs strengthen workforce readiness and certainly buoy local economies. And of course, that all feeds the national competitiveness and the need for innovation, particularly as we are all facing what AI is going to do the job market and the economy. We know that hands-on learning in particular improves attendance and engagement, particularly among certain populations that may not be excited about certain subjects during the regular school day. Federal investments certainly leverage state, local, philanthropic, and industry partnerships. And if you are seeing that happen in your community, lawmakers certainly want to hear those stories. And of course, we would argue that cuts today would create long-term talent pipeline issues, and we don't want to see that as a community or as a country.
A few closing comments here. If you haven't seen it already, the National Science Foundation did issue a request for information on the Presidential Award for Excellence in Math and Science Teaching. Those of you who've been around a while remember this is more or less the Nobel Prize for math and science educators. It used to come along with a $10,000 award and recognition at the White House in a ceremony. It disappeared unceremoniously during COVID and never made its way back. This administration paused this effort in April of last year officially and said they were going to review what they could do to continue this. This is the RFI that does that. So this is another participation opportunity. It's a great one because this is a very beloved program by many in the STEM education space. There are a number of new things emerging from the administration on AI skills and training. The latest one is an MOU between Labor and the National Science Foundation, laying out essentially how they're going to operate in tandem on addressing AI skills. That's a growing area of interest for our community. There are a variety of groups looking at prior year grant funds that are being held back at IES, the National Science Foundation, and NIH. You can click on those links for more information there. There's the curious case of the administration nominating a new NSF director to fill that post, which has been vacant for some time. The nomination is held in front of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, not the Senate Science Committee. And so that committee hasn't met for some time. The chairman of that committee is in a race to win his primary to come back into Congress next year. So that's going to be held up for some time. That's a means for addressing many of the NSF issues by Congress. The administration just recently moved to terminate all of the members of the National Science Board and said they're going to relook at how they're going to constitute the National Science Board. This has also happened at the Department of Energy and its various different advisory committees. So that's going to be a process over the next probably year to renominate people to the National Science Board. One exciting thing was the Artemis mission. If you haven't followed that in any great detail, it made its way into lots of different classrooms, and NASA has a variety of resources on the Artemis mission. That space mission in particular has characterized a lot of what the administration's done within space programs and the NASA STEM Education Office. And then obviously we're just Tuesday was 6 months out from Election Day. You probably followed what's been going on in some of the primaries and the redistricting process, but we're very much into election season. We're also in allergy season, by the way. But that's increasingly going to characterize the tone coming from Washington, D.C. If you didn't think it was political now, it's going to get a lot more political for the next 6 months.
So the bottom line here is that FY27 is a defining year for all of the things that we care about. We really need your voices and hope you'll lend them to our campaign. And we'll talk in a month about how we're doing on that front.
Thanks, Della and James. Hi, everyone. So I am going to take just a couple of minutes to talk about some after-school related and informal STEM education related resources and convenings that you should all be aware of. So the first thing is, as some of you may be aware, that the After School Alliance does a big research report every 5 years called America After 3 p.m., which looks at the data around after school, what the parental demand and satisfaction is. And I just put a link in the chat that talks about the national report that got released in October of 2025. We are currently working on the STEM special report, which will come out in August. But before that, a special report on summer, what the demand and satisfaction numbers look like and what young people and families are experiencing around access to summer programming will be coming out in just a couple of weeks. And the information is on this slide. You can register for the webinar to get the very first look at the report, and then it will be available on our website. And then after that, on today, actually, the National Academies is holding their first public meeting on a new consensus study that they have launched on informal STEM learning. This is a follow-on to the seminal Learning Science in Informal Environments report that was published in 2009, and a lot has changed in the landscape of informal STEM learning since 2009. And so this consensus study is kicking off and looking at where things are now and what the next decade of informal STEM learning could and should look like.
So with that, I'm going to say, I hope everyone has a great day. I hope to see you on the next meeting with the National Academies, and we'll see you at the next STEM Talk in June. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you for joining us for this insightful discussion on the policy landscape affecting STEM education and workforce development. We hope you've gained valuable perspectives and actionable strategies from our conversations. We'll continue this important dialogue with critical insights about top STEM priorities and more guidance on navigating the current advocacy landscape. To learn more about the work of STEM Education Coalition, After School STEM Hub, and STEM ecosystems, please visit our websites. Until next time, keep advocating for a strong STEM education and workforce nationwide.